Hi, welcome back. This is part A for the herringbone cowl, and it refers to the cable cast on. I wanted to make a revision and an expansion of that section because I actually make a mistake when I put the stitch markers on. The first thing, though, is more of a revision. I started that cable cast on with a slip knot, which is what all the books do. However, that's one more knot to deal with, and it actually stretches out the distance of the legs of the first stitch when you go to put your markers on, and I'll show you that in a minute. If you'd want to eliminate that knot, the simplest way is simply to make a 6 to 8 inch tail, hold the yarn, this is the working yarn on the right, you make that loop, take your loop of yarn and cross your legs over so that they're clockwise and the working yarn is on top of the tail. Put it on your pipe. Now take your crochet hook. You're going to have to hold both strands of this. There's not attached to anything without the slip knot, which makes it a little trickier. Now take your crochet hook through and hook the working yarn. And as you do that, it'll put another twist in that. Now, once you have it hooked, you can pull it up. So now I have, let me turn it around so it's easier to see. Here's my working yarn. There's my tail hanging down, if you can see that. And my working yarn looks like this, with the working yarn going down to the ball and around my fingers and back through the stitch. Now pipe that. Now you can snug it up without making it too tight. Remember, you have to knit into that, all those stitches. So now you may continue as usual, just as I showed in part B. So I'm going to put on 6 stitches, and it's just as before. You say that this is the working yarn going down to the ball on the right side if I pull it, and you want the loop to go around like so. So there's our 4th stitch. Make sure you're going under both legs of the stitch. So we're just going to put on 6, and that's enough to show here. Now let me turn this around. I had said in the video, part B of my video, just do it like lesson 6, but you can't, because look where your tail is and look where your working yarn is. There's not going to be a stitch marker up here at the far end like there is on lesson 6. The other thing that makes us a bit quirky is the cable cast on beginning. So when I did the cable, when I showed you where to put these markers on in part B of this video, I started my markers. It's kind of hard to see because of this one portion of the working yarn, but if you can see that here's the tail, here's my first stitch beginning here, and it goes around and it comes here. And notice this is the same stitch. I have 6 stitches here, but underneath it looks like these are 2 separate stitches. Well, they're not, but their legs are in different places. So I put my first stitch marker here, and that was incorrect. You need to start here on this little land bridge, if you will, between the 2 legs of one stitch. And by eliminating the slip knot, you shorten up that distance. It'll look better at the end, and it'll be 1 fewer knot. So when you go to put your stitch marker on, it might even be easier to start at the very end where your last stitch is. So there is a stitch marker. Okay, and now move your working yarn so that you can see here is the next stitch. You're not going to have those little V's like you did before. And again, I think it's easier to alternate your colors. Whoops. And make sure you're going right over, right under all the yarn between this stitch and the next. And when you get through, there won't be one you have to tie on at the end like in lesson 6. So there's 3. Now these, are not offset the way they are at the end. So it's a little easier to tell. But you want to make sure you're not going through the yarn. You want to be under the yarn between the cable and the pipe. Now, when you do this next one, you'll say to yourself, which is what I did the other day, that I was done. You see, because it looks like, well, that would be for both those stitches, but it's really not. When you go to knit that, one leg separates and creates a stitch there. It'll look funny, and I'm going to show you the cast off. So now you have a stitch marker around this leg over this little area where the tail is, and here's the other leg of the stitch. So you have 6 stitch markers on and 6 stitches. I hope that makes more sense. So, like I say, it's easier to start where you ended up and come backwards. And now that you have your stitch markers on, and you don't have to join your scarf this way. I just think it ends up looking nicer. It does create a surface braid, and I consider the surface braid, you know, the right side of the fabric. So now I have put on a long piece so I can actually show you the cast off. Now, when you've taken it off, like I said, like I did the other day, you know that this side, the wrong side of the herringbone, is going to face out. So this has to go on this side. Oops, put on the wrong pipe. We're going to do it on these little ones, and you'll see it's a little bit trickier. Now, I'm going to turn it this way. Pull off enough of your working yarn from your ball so that you can lay it over the piece. Now, if you want your scarf to not twist, you can put your wrong sides together, like so. But for my scarves, for the video, I twisted it one time. So take your end with the stitch markers, and you're just going to twist it one time, like so. So that basically the right side is going to be against the wrong side. Now, let me turn it just like so. Here is your tail, so disregard that. This was the end of the row. Now, take your working yarn in your right hand. I prefer to cast off on this side because I'm right-handed. It's a little simpler. But you can do it either side. It doesn't matter. And you're going to do it as knit stitches because it's easier and it'll make that braid. So when you come through the first stitch, you'll have your working yarn in your right hand. Turn that a little bit. Your working yarn in your right hand, and you come through the first stitch in the row. And if you have trouble, just go in underneath that stitch marker to open that up a little bit and push your yarn through. You're going from the inside, if you will, to the outside so that you can grab the working yarn. Now it's coming through and you've made a new loop. This is your new stitch in now it's on my fingers. And I'm holding the yarn, the working yarn, down across my palm. Now take off one stitch and place it over the working yarn and pull up on the working yarn so that you can pipe it to the other side, and now snug it up. And now go to your next stitch, and you know that needs to be orange, so come along here and feel around with your left hand to make sure you're in the stitch. And now push the yarn through, again from the back to the front. Now I have my little piece of working yarn sticking out. Pull it, let go with your hand down here so that you can get the yarn through. Make sure it's not wrapped around your stitch marker, but leave those in case you make a mistake and you need to go back. So now my working yarn is around my fingers. I take off another stitch, pull my working yarn up, pipe it. Now I have 2 stitches on. I can snug my stitch up, and I will now bind off by picking up and removing the first stitch I made over the second. So, if you forget where you're at, just feel where the working yarn is coming through. Well, that's right there where that orange stitch marker is. I have to go to this blue one next. And I do the same thing. Kind of poke your finger through from the right to the front to the back, lay the working yarn against your finger, and poke it up through, pull on the working yarn. Make sure it's not caught around something on the side of your table or something like that. And now here's the working yarn coming through that stitch. Put it on your fingers. I'm trying to stay out of the way. Take off the stitch, put it over the working yarn, pull the working yarn up. It'll look just like this. Pipe it, snug it up, not too tight. Now take your first stitch and lift it up and over. And that's the blue one. Come down to the orange. And you just keep going all the way down, taking the yarn from the back to the front, pulling the working yarn through, putting the working yarn on your fingers, take off a stitch. Can't quite, am I out of the way of the camera here? I can't quite tell that. And then take that stitch, the old stitch, put it over the working yarn and pull the working yarn up. I'll try another angle here. And then bind it off. So it should only be one when you go to the next stitch. Now I can see that my working yarn came through that orange stitch marker. Now we go through the blue, just like that. It'll be hard to see because it's just a tiny little opening. Okay, now take off another stitch, bring it forward and over your working yarn as if to knit it. And take your stitch, put it up on the pipe, take the first stitch and swing it up and over the previous stitch. Now we're down to another orange stitch. It's always a good idea too to, you know, if there's 5 stitch markers left, there should be 5 stitches up on your pipe. And again, you're going to take this stitch, put it over the working yarn on your finger, pull the working yarn up. You'll have to release the tension of your hand. You know, depending on the kind of yarn, you may not even have to hold the yarn, you know, down here. In fact, maybe we'll do the next ones without doing that. Maybe the show up better. So now you bind that off again. That's always the last step. You want to make sure you don't take off that second stitch. So now, that was an orange one. So I have to go back to the blue. Again, just put your finger through where you see that stitch marker. Kind of stretch that out just enough that you can get the yarn through there. And once you've poked it through with your right finger, you can pull it up. So here's the new stitch, basically. Put that on your finger, okay? And then if you take your stitch off and put it over, pull up your new stitch, tighten it up a little bit, and we have 3 stitches on and 3 stitch markers. And we just keep going until we're done. Now, when you have a lot of stitches, like on the cowls, you might want to put a second stitch marker every 5th one or something like that, and you'll know sooner if you've gotten off somewhere. If you've, especially if your stitch markers are small, it's easy to lose them in the piece. For those of you who can just sew it together with the yarn, by all means, do it that way, but I think this makes a nicer edge. I'm never very good at sewing them up without the looking sloppy. And this is the last one. Now, when you take this off and put it on, and again, bind this off, you will have 1 stitch remaining. And in theory, now I'm going to put this down here on the table and get rid of this. In theory, you could pull this up, you know, cut your yarn. In fact, we're going to cut the yarn. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and cut the yarn. Again, this was our last stitch. And if I continued to pull that working yarn through, it would stay. And none of these. But notice how there's a little bit of gapping at the bottom of this. And what I normally do to eliminate that is take my, again, this was my last stitch, is to take my working yarn back through here one more time so that it looks like this. And when you pull up, that will kind of gather that first point. Now, you notice now I have a knot, though, on my end. But once you've gathered this, again, it'll depend on how bulky your yarn is too. There are some tricks on straight knitting needles to eliminate that little gap on the last stitch. It's because you don't make a turn. That's where that slip stitch is. So again, just like in lesson 6 I showed you, very gently just pull your sides to the center, and then you'll see here is your original tail, and here is the tail of your working yarn at the very end. And you notice there is a little knot here. But once you've turned this in to the inside, I said that the braid was the good side, especially since it's a bit bulky. And if you want to eliminate that, you can sew this up another way. Now, if you've made a mistake, and I'm just going to show this real quick. This was the side that, or you don't like it. Let's say it just didn't turn out very well. You can see that turns out better than the scarf I showed you the other day, and that's because the cast on is better. So, if you've made a mistake and you want to undo this, start at where you ended up and untie that. Now, pull gently on your, this is the end of your working yarn when you ended the project. Now you're going to pull this out. This is why I say leave your stitch markers in. And even if you have to go back a row, because this is so densely woven, and there's no halo to this, so it's easy to pull out, you could pull out easily, one row at a time, and go back to fix your mistake. It's easy to forget your slip knot. Now you say, uh-oh, but where was I? Well, you know that this has to be on the outside. And this has to be, so it can't be here, if you know what I'm saying. It has to be here. And then one by one, if it's a big heavy thing like a rug, use a knitting needle to pick up your stitches. And then just simply repipe them back onto your pipe. Don't tear the whole piece out again, because that was a lot of work. You know, it's about 2.5 hours to make this. And then just re-knit your last couple rows, or, you know, to go back to the area of your mistake and then go from there. Don't restart the whole piece. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Hope it clears things up.